Picture this. It's a cold December night in Paris, 2008. Two entrepreneurs, Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp, are standing on a snow-dusted street corner, watching taxis pass them by, one after another, none stopping, their frustration mounting with each passing car. And in that moment of irritation, that simple human moment of wanting to get somewhere and not being able to, an idea is born. Camp pulls out a napkin at a nearby cafe. Kalanick starts sketching. What if you could tap a button on your phone and a car would just come to you? No waving, no waiting, no uncertainty. That napkin sketch would eventually become Uber. But more than that, it would become a symbol, a Rorschach test for how we think about technology, capitalism, work, and disruption itself. The early days of Uber feel almost quaint now. In 2010, they launched with just 10 drivers in San Francisco. 10. Black cars only. It wasn't for everyone. It was premium, almost exclusive. But the magic was in the simplicity. You open an app, pressed a button, and a car appeared. It felt like the future. And the future, apparently, moved fast. By 2013, just 3 years later, Uber had expanded to 100 cities worldwide. 100? That's not growth. That's explosion. That's a rocket strapped to a skateboard, as Kalanick himself might say. But here's the thing about moving that fast. You don't always check if the wheels are on straight. Uber's playbook wasn't about sustainability or profitability. It was about conquest, expansion at all costs. The term growth hacker became fashionable in Silicon Valley around this time. The idea that you could engineer virality, game systems, and prioritize user acquisition over everything else, including making money. Uber embodied this philosophy completely. They weren't building a business in the traditional sense. They were building an empire, and empires don't pause to count pennies. But let's rewind for a moment. Let's talk about what it felt like to be inside Uber during those early years. Because culture, company culture, that's where the seeds of everything that followed were planted. Travis Kalanick wasn't just a CEO. He was a force of nature. Charismatic, brash, unapologetic. He had this magnetic energy that drew people in, investors, employees, drivers. He made you believe that rules were for other people, that the old ways of doing things were obstacles to be demolished, not guidelines to be respected. In 2014, a Slack channel circulated within Uber called Boob Pics. Yes, you heard that right. Employees shared exactly what you think they shared. And the worst part, it wasn't hidden. It wasn't whispered about. It was normalized. The culture didn't just tolerate this behavior. It celebrated it. The message was clear. If you were aggressive, if you pushed boundaries, if you played the game hard, you were rewarded. Kalanick himself embodied this ethos. There are stories of him hosting champagne toasts whenever Uber successfully poached employees from Lyft, their main competitor. He had nicknames for rivals, calling them candy ass, as if being ethical or cautious was somehow weak. This wasn't just business. This was war. And in war, Kalanick believed you don't follow the Geneva Convention. Now, while all of this was happening, this internal culture of aggression and rule-breaking, the outside world was watching Uber's valuation skyrocket. Let's put some numbers to this. In 2011, Uber raised their series of funding round at a valuation of $60 million. $60 million. That's a lot of money, sure, but in Silicon Valley terms, it's a modest start. Fast forward just 4 years to 2015, and Uber's valuation had ballooned to $40 billion. $40 billion. How does that happen? Part of it was genuine innovation. People loved the service. But a huge part of it was spectacle. Uber attracted massive investments from players like Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, which poured $3.5 billion into the company. These weren't just investments. They were bets on a vision of the future where Uber owned urban transportation entirely, where taxis were extinct, where car ownership itself might become obsolete. But here's what often gets lost in these dizzying valuations: the people on the ground, the drivers. In those early days, before surge pricing, before the algorithmic management systems became so sophisticated, driving for Uber could actually be lucrative. Some early drivers reported making $25 an hour or more. For many people, immigrants, retirees, folks between jobs, this was life-changing. Flexible work that paid decently. But then came the deductions. Mileage, maintenance, fees. Suddenly, that $25 an hour started looking more like $15 than $12. And the flexibility. It began to feel less like freedom and more like a trap. You could work whenever you wanted, sure, but if you wanted to make a living wage, you had to work all the time. Evenings, weekends, holidays. The app became a kind of boss that never slept. And when drivers started quitting en masse, Uber didn't pause to ask why. They just recruited more. The model depended on a constant churn of new drivers, and the venture capital money made that churn affordable for a while. But let's not get too dark yet. Because in those early years, Uber also did things that were genuinely exciting, genuinely fun. Remember the San Francisco black car launch in 2012? Uber invited celebrities and influencers to try the service. Suddenly, the same car service that tech workers used to get to meetings was also ferrying movie stars and musicians around the city. It went viral before viral was a strategy. People wanted in on this exclusive club. And then there was Kalanick himself on Twitter, distilling his entire philosophy into pithy sound bites. One tweet became legendary. We're going to take a strategy and tape a rocket to it. No nuance. No caution. Just speed. This was the Uber story that the public saw. Bold. Innovative. A little dangerous, sure, but in a thrilling way. The company that was going to blow up the taxi industry and save us all from standing in the rain with our arms up, hoping for a yellow cab to notice us. But behind the scenes, the methods Uber used to achieve this growth were, let's say, questionable. In 2014, Uber developed an internal tool called Scalpel. And what did Scalpel do? It scraped data from Lyft. Uber employees could see where Lyft drivers were, how many rides they were doing, even specific booking patterns. Corporate espionage dressed up as competitive intelligence. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern. Uber's culture rewarded rule breakers. If you figured out a clever way to sidestep regulations, you got stock options. If you found a loophole in local taxi laws, you got promoted. The internal message was consistent. Results matter, methods don't. And nowhere was this more visible than in Uber's international expansion. When Uber launched in India in 2013, they walked into a market that already had a fierce local competitor, Ola. The rivalry became legendary. Both companies started subsidizing rides at unsustainable rates. Sometimes passengers paid almost nothing. Uber burned through over $100 million in subsidies, essentially paying people to use their service. And Kalanick? He loved it. Photos from that era show him at Bollywood parties, posing with stars, soaking in the attention. Uber's growth in India was over 1,000% in some periods. It was chaos. It was expensive. And in Kalanick's mind, it was glorious. But not everyone bought into the hustle culture religion. Oscar Salazar, employee number 1 at Uber, quit in 2013. Not because he was tired. Not because he got a better offer. He left over ethics. He saw what the company was becoming and wanted no part of it. Uber's internal hustle Bible glorified 80-hour workweeks. Employees burned out at staggering rates, around 30% annual turnover. But that was fine, because there were always more believers waiting to join the rocket ship. And the rocket was flying. Revenue went from $200 million in 2012 to $11 billion in 2018. Uber was winning. There's a story from those early days that captures everything about Uber's approach. Kalanick personally funded iPhones for drivers who couldn't afford them. He wanted to remove every barrier to entry, to flood the streets with Uber cars. It was generous, in a way. But it was also calculated. Those drivers were loyal, at least until the deductions kicked in and they realized the iPhone was basically a company store loan. At Uber's headquarters in San Francisco, there was a pirate flag hanging. Literally. Pirate flag. The symbolism wasn't subtle. This was a company that saw itself as operating outside the rules, raiding the establishment. And in 2015, Kalanick gave a TED Talk where he said something that would define his legacy. Disruption is evolution. But here's the question that haunts this entire story. What if disruption isn't evolution? What if it's just disruption? What if moving fast and breaking things means you break people along the way? What if the pirate flag isn't romantic, it's a warning? We'll explore those questions as we go deeper. Because the story of Uber isn't just about one company. It's about what happens when ambition meets amorality, when innovation collides with humanity. And trust me, it gets darker from here. There's an old saying in business, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. Uber didn't just follow this advice. They weaponized it. They turned it into corporate strategy, into an entire philosophy of expansion. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about disruption. Real disruption, the kind that reshapes entire industries, it often requires operating in gray areas. Or sometimes, let's be honest, in areas that aren't gray at all. Areas that are clearly, definitively illegal. And Uber, they didn't just step into those areas. They sprinted into them with a pirate flag and a legal team on speed dial. Let's travel to Austin, Texas. The year is 2016. It's the city's annual South by Southwest festival. Music, tech, film, barbecue, and optimism all colliding in the Texas heat. Uber and Lyft are everywhere. You can't walk 2 blocks without seeing someone climb into a rideshare. But Austin City Council had recently passed an ordinance requiring all rideshare drivers to undergo fingerprint-based background checks. The same checks taxi drivers have been subject to for years. The reasoning was simple: public safety. If someone's getting into a stranger's car, shouldn't that stranger be thoroughly vetted? Uber and Lyft saw it differently. They called it regulatory overreach. Burdensome. Unnecessary. They claimed their own background check systems were sufficient, arguably even better than fingerprinting. So they did something remarkable. They left. Both companies pulled out of Austin entirely, abandoning drivers and riders in what felt like a corporate tantrum. But they didn't just leave. They came back swinging. Uber poured $3 million into a ballot initiative, Proposition 1. $3 million in a city council election. For context, that's an astronomical amount for local politics. They hired consultants, ran TV ads, flooded mailboxes. The message was clear: vote yes or you lose Uber. It was a flex, a show of force, a message not just to Austin, but to every city watching. We will outspend you. We will out-campaign you. We will make you regret trying to regulate us. And you know what happened? Voters rejected Proposition 1. They said no to Uber. But here's the twist. Uber came back anyway. Because ultimately, the Texas state legislature passed a law that overrode Austin's local ordinance. Uber played the long game, and they won. Not through democratic process at the local level, but by going over the heads of the voters who had rejected them. The lesson wasn't about fingerprints. It was about power. Now, while Uber was fighting public battles in places like Austin, they were also waging secret wars. Wars most of us never heard about until years later. Let me tell you about Grayball. In 2015, Uber developed a tool, innocuously named Grayball, that was, in essence, a sophisticated system for evading law enforcement. Here's how it worked. Uber's algorithms could identify users who were likely to be regulators or cops trying to catch drivers operating illegally. Maybe they had credit cards linked to government agencies. Maybe their usage patterns seemed off: lots of short rides, always canceling, always in areas where enforcement was active. Once identified, these users were grayballed. When they opened the Uber app, they'd see a fake version. Ghost cars on a fake map. They could request rides that would never come. They were in a digital Potemkin village, completely unaware they were being deceived. And this wasn't just happening in one city. Grayball was deployed in at least 10 countries. Portland, Paris, Boston, Seoul. Wherever regulators were cracking down, Uber fought back with code. Think about that for a moment. A private company, created technology specifically designed to deceive government officials trying to enforce the law. Not to serve customers better. Not to improve safety. But to avoid accountability. When this story broke in 2017, the backlash was swift. The Federal Trade Commission launched a probe. Eventually, Uber paid a $20 million fine, which, let's be honest, for a company valued in the tens of billions, was essentially a parking ticket, a cost of doing business. But the damage to Uber's reputation was real. Because Grayball revealed something important. This wasn't a company that occasionally bent rules. This was a company that systematically, technologically, strategically undermined the rule of law. And then there's Australia. When Uber launched in Australia in 2014, they ran into a problem. Many of their drivers didn't have the proper licenses required to operate commercial vehicles. These weren't just formalities. Australian law had specific requirements for commercial transport. So what did Uber do? They allegedly provided drivers with fake doctor's notes, letters claiming medical conditions that would exempt them from certain licensing requirements. It was brazen. It was ridiculous. And when authorities caught on, Uber was fined 26,000 Australian dollars. 26,000 for systematically helping drivers circumvent licensing laws. But here's the kicker. By the time they were fined, Uber had already gained over 1 million users in Australia. The fine was noise. The user base was a fortress. Brazil, 2015. The situation is different, but the playbook is similar. When Uber launched in major Brazilian cities, the reaction from established taxi drivers was volcanic. Riots, physical attacks on Uber drivers, cars vandalized, windows smashed. It got dangerous fast. And Uber's response? They didn't pull out. They doubled down. The company started funding self-defense classes for drivers, teaching people how to protect themselves in case of assault. It was part practical support, part PR move, part statement. We're not leaving. Brazilian cities started issuing bans, but Uber fought back with injunctions, tying up cases in court for months or years. And during that legal limbo, they kept operating, kept growing, kept recruiting drivers and signing up riders. By the time the legal battles resolved, mostly in Uber's favor, they were already embedded in the fabric of Brazilian cities. Banning them at that point would have felt like ripping out infrastructure. Now let's zoom back to the United States, because what Uber was doing internationally, they were also perfecting at home, just with more sophistication. In 2016 alone, Uber spent $5 million on lobbying. $5 million to influence federal and state officials. They didn't just lobby for favorable laws. They worked to elect pro-Uber politicians, campaign contributions, super PACs, the works. But here's where it gets really interesting. Uber also funded what are known as AstroTurf groups. These are organizations that look like grassroots movements, but are actually corporate-funded. Groups with names like Drivers United for Progress or Coalition for Rideshare Opportunities. They'd show up at city council hearings packed with people in matching shirts, testifying about how much they love driving for Uber. And maybe some of them did love it. But the coordinated nature, the funding, the talking points, it was orchestrated. It was designed to manufacture the appearance of popular support. Democracy, meet disruption. London, 2019. If there's one city that represents Uber's regulatory struggles, it's London. The city first granted Uber a license, then revoked it, then granted it again, then revoked it again. It was a regulatory soap opera that stretched over years. The second revocation came after Transport for London, the city's regulatory body, discovered that Uber drivers were using fake insurance documents, and in some cases, drivers were sharing accounts, meaning passengers had no idea who was actually driving them. This was serious. Not just rule-breaking for the sake of expansion, but failures that genuinely compromised passenger safety. And this time, something different happened. Dara Khosrowshahi, who had replaced Kalanick as CEO in 2017, did something Kalanick likely never would have done. He apologized. Not a corporate non-apology. A real one. Reports from the time describe him as tearful, genuinely contrite. He acknowledged that Uber had failed Londoners, that they needed to do better. And it worked. Sort of. London granted Uber a probationary license, 5 years, with strict oversight. But they were back. But the most stunning example of Uber's regulatory strategy, The masterpiece, really, was Proposition 22 in California. Let me set the stage. In 2019, California passed Assembly Bill 5 or AB 5. This law made it much harder for companies to classify workers as independent contractors instead of employees. And it was aimed directly at gig economy companies: Uber, Lyft, DoorDash. If drivers were employees, these companies would have to provide benefits, pay minimum wage, cover unemployment insurance. It would fundamentally change their business model, possibly destroy it. So what did Uber do? They went to war. Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash together spent $204 million on Proposition 22, a ballot initiative to exempt app-based drivers from AB 5. $204 million. It was the most expensive ballot initiative in California history. The campaign was everywhere. TV ads with drivers talking about flexibility. Billboards. In-app messages when you opened Uber. Text messages. Mailers. The message was consistent: protect driver flexibility. Vote yes on Prop 22. And it worked. Prop 22 passed with 58% of the vote. But here's the truly remarkable part. Prop 22 became a blueprint. Other states watched what happened in California and started replicating it. As of 2025, 14 states have passed laws exempting gig workers from employee classification, many of them modeled directly on California's Prop 22. Uber spent $204 million and essentially rewrote labor law not just in California, but across the country. That's not lobbying. That's not influence. That's structural change achieved through sheer financial force. And it's worked incredibly well. As of 2025, Uber operates in 10,500 cities worldwide. 10,500. Despite having been banned in over 50 cities at various points, almost all of those bans have been lifted, overturned, or circumvented through court battles. The strategy is clear. Enter markets even when it's illegal. Build user base. Fight in courts. Outlast regulators. Wait for laws to change or for political winds to shift. Win. It's exhausting for cities to fight. It's expensive. And by the time they might actually win, Uber's already so embedded that removing them feels impossible. Let me tell you a story that captures the essence of Uber's approach. New York City. Mayor Bill de Blasio proposes a cap on the number of for-hire vehicles, a direct response to Uber's explosive growth that's clogging streets and hurting yellow cab drivers. Kalanick doesn't lobby quietly. He doesn't negotiate behind closed doors. He goes nuclear. Uber launches a feature in their app called de Blasio Mode. When users in New York open the app, instead of seeing cars nearby, they see almost nothing, a visualization of what the city would look like if the mayor's cap passed. Wait times, 25 minutes. Cars available, nearly zero. It was political theater inside a consumer app. Millions of New Yorkers saw it. The message was clear: blame the mayor, not us. And then Kalanick met with de Blasio personally. According to reports, Kalanick essentially threatened to pull Uber from the city if the cap passed, which would enrage hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers right before an election. De Blasio backed down. The cap was dropped. That's not disruption. That's leverage. That's power. Every company likes to tell the story of its rise. The vision. The innovation. The triumph over obstacles. But there's another story that matters just as much. Maybe more. The story of what happens when growth comes at the expense of safety. When speed trumps responsibility. When the people using your service or providing it become collateral damage in your quest for market dominance. This is that story. Late 2016. Somewhere in Uber's sprawling network of servers, an intrusion occurs. Hackers, skilled ones, breach Uber's systems and extract data on 57 million riders and drivers. Names, email addresses, phone numbers. For drivers, even their driver's license information. 57 million people. Compromised. Now, when a data breach happens, and in our digital age, they happen with disturbing frequency, there are protocols. Legal requirements. Companies are supposed to notify affected users. report to regulators, offer credit monitoring services. It's not just good practice. In many jurisdictions, it's the law. Uber did none of that. Instead, they made a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice. They decided to hide it. For 9 months, Uber kept the breach secret. But it's actually worse than just staying quiet. They paid the hackers $100,000 not to return the data, but to delete it and keep quiet. They disguised the payment as a bug bounty, a reward program companies use to pay security researchers who find vulnerabilities. Except these weren't security researchers responsibly disclosing a flaw. These were criminals who had stolen data on 57 million people. When the truth finally emerged in late 2017, leaked by insiders who couldn't stomach the cover-up, the fallout was devastating. Uber's new CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, had only been on the job for a few months. This was his welcome to Uber moment. His predecessors had left him a ticking time bomb, and it had just exploded. The legal settlements eventually totaled $148 million. But the real cost? Trust. How do you tell riders and drivers that their safety and privacy matter when you've just proven that, when it counted, they didn't? But data breaches, as serious as they are abstract. Numbers on a screen. Legal settlements. What we need to talk about next is more visceral, more human, and much, much harder. In 2019, Uber released its first-ever safety report. It was a remarkable document, remarkable not just for what it revealed, but for the fact that it existed at all. Most companies would never voluntarily disclose this kind of information. The report covered the years 2017 and 2018, and it documented 3,045 sexual assaults in the United States alone. 3,045. In 2 years. Let me be clear about what these numbers represent. These aren't allegations that Uber committed assault. These are assaults that occurred within the Uber ecosystem. Riders assaulting drivers, drivers assaulting riders, and in some cases, riders assaulting other riders in shared rides. The spectrum ranged from non-consensual touching to rape. And while Uber serves hundreds of millions of rides, meaning the percentage is statistically small, percentages don't matter when you're one of the 3,045. Uber's response was to implement a zero-tolerance policy. If you're accused of assault, verified assault, you're deactivated permanently. According to their data, they deactivate about 1% of riders annually for various safety violations. But here's what haunts this issue. For every reported assault, how many went unreported? How many drivers, especially women drivers, experienced harassment that they didn't categorize as assault but that made them feel unsafe? How many riders had uncomfortable experiences that fell into gray areas they didn't know how to report? And the challenges facing drivers extended far beyond safety concerns. They were also economic. In 2015, Uber made what they called an algorithm tweak. That's the kind of bland corporate language that hides significant impact. This tweak changed how driver pay was calculated, and when the dust settled, drivers found their earnings had dropped by roughly 20%. 20%. Imagine your paycheck suddenly being a fifth smaller. But here's the thing about the algorithm. Drivers couldn't see it, couldn't understand it, couldn't contest it. They just opened their app one day and found that the same amount of work was generating significantly less money. Uber would argue that they needed to lower prices to stay competitive, to grow the market, to keep riders using the service. And from a pure business strategy perspective, maybe that's true. But the people absorbing that business decision weren't shareholders or executives. They were drivers, many of whom were already living paycheck to paycheck. Then came the Uber files. In 2022, a massive leak of internal documents, over 124,000 records, was obtained by The Guardian and shared with media organizations worldwide. The documents, spanning 2013 to 2017, reveal the inner workings of Uber's global expansion in stunning detail. And one of the most damning revelations? Evidence of Uber's systematic lobbying in the European Union, including what appeared to be favoritism from certain officials. Documents showing how Uber worked to undermine labor protections, how they strategize around regulations, how they leveraged political connections. But even more than the specific revelations, the Uber files confirmed what many had suspected, that the rule-breaking wasn't accidental or occasional. It was systematic. It was policy. And it went all the way to the top. New Year's Eve, Sydney, 2017. It's one of the world's great New Year's celebrations. The harbor, the Opera House, fireworks that light up the southern sky, and hundreds of thousands of people trying to get home when it's all over. That's when surge pricing does what it's designed to do, respond to extreme demand. But that night, surge pricing in Sydney hit 9.9 times the normal rate. Nearly 10 times. A ride that would normally cost $20 suddenly cost $200. And people paid it because what choice did they have? It was late. They were tired, public transit was overwhelmed, and the algorithm told them this was the price. Now, Uber would argue, and has argued, that surge pricing is necessary, that it incentivizes more drivers to get on a road during peak times, increasing supply to meet demand. Economics 101. And there's truth to that. But there's also something deeply uncomfortable about an algorithm exploiting people's desperation. About a system that says, your need is my opportunity. The backlash to instances like Sydney NYE was significant enough that Uber eventually implemented caps in about 20 cities. But those caps came grudgingly, after lawsuits, after public outrage, after regulatory pressure. Not because the company decided it was the right thing to do. While all of this was happening, Uber was also trying to expand beyond ride-sharing. They launched Uber Eats, betting that the same model that worked for moving people could work for moving food. And people loved it. The convenience of restaurant delivery from places that had never offered it before, that was genuinely appealing. But profitable, that was another story. Between 2018 and 2020, Uber poured $5.8 billion into subsidizing Uber Eats. Nearly $6 billion. They were paying restaurants more than customers paid them, paying drivers more than the delivery fees covered, all in the name of growth. And they got creative. Robot delivery pilots in San Francisco, autonomous sidewalk robots that would trundle along carrying someone's burrito. It was futuristic. It was innovative. It was also a disaster. The robots crashed into things. They got stuck. They blocked sidewalks. The pilot was quietly discontinued. Let's talk about deactivation. Because if you're a driver, this is the sword hanging over your head every single day. Uber uses an algorithmic rating system. Riders rate drivers. If your rating falls below a certain threshold, currently around 4.6 out of 5 stars in most markets, you can be deactivated, kicked off the platform. No more income. And here's the thing, you don't need to do anything dramatically wrong. Maybe you had a bad week. Maybe you got a few riders who were having bad days and took it out on your rating. Maybe someone didn't like the music you were playing, or thought you talked too much, or didn't talk enough. According to Uber's data, algorithmic deactivations affect about 25% of drivers annually. 1 in 4. Some are eventually reinstated, but as of 2019, only about 10% of drivers who appeal deactivation successfully get back on the platform. Think about that from a driver's perspective. You're an independent contractor, which means no unemployment insurance, no wrongful termination protections, and your livelihood depends on an algorithm that you don't fully understand, responding to ratings from customers you can't choose. And then came COVID-19. The pandemic hit the gig economy like a wrecking ball. In the early months of 2020, ride volume plummeted by 80% in some cities. Drivers who depended on Uber income suddenly had almost nothing. But as cities began reopening and people started riding again, a new problem emerged. Assaults spiked. In 2020, reported rider assaults in the United States increased by 40% compared to pre-pandemic levels. Why? It's hard to say definitively. Maybe it was pandemic-related stress. Maybe people have forgot how to behave in shared spaces. Maybe it was the tension around mask mandates, which Uber required but that some riders refused to follow. Uber issued over 100,000 fines for mask mandate violations, but enforcement was inconsistent, and it often put drivers in impossible positions. Do you refuse to drive someone not wearing a mask and risk a bad rating? Or do you transport them and risk your own health? March 2018. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. 10 p.m. A self-driving Uber vehicle, part of the company's ambitious autonomous vehicle program, strikes and kills a pedestrian. Her name was Elaine Herzberg. She was 49 years old. It was the first pedestrian death involving a self-driving car. And when investigators examined what happened, they found something chilling. The car's sensors had detected Herzberg. The system had identified her as an object in the road. But the car's emergency braking had been disabled to prevent erratic driving. And the human safety driver behind the wheel? She was watching something on her phone, not paying attention. Uber's response was to immediately pause all self-driving operations. But the damage, both to Herzberg's family and to Uber's reputation, was profound. Uber's ambitions extended into freight too. Uber Freight, an attempt to do for trucking what they'd done for ride-sharing. Match loads with drivers through an app. Streamline logistics. The losses by 2023? Over $2 billion. The average driver wait time was supposed to be about 4 minutes, impressively efficient. But during peak periods, waits sometimes stretched to 20 minutes or more. For truck drivers pay by the load, time is money. Those delays added up. 2019 Ohio, a cyclist is killed in an accident involving an Uber driver. The family sues. And during the legal proceedings, something troubling emerges. Uber's insurance policy had a capped $1 million, which sounds like a lot until you realize that in a wrongful death case, involving someone with decades of earning potential ahead of them, $1 million doesn't come close to covering the actual damages. The case settled for $400,000. But it exposed a broader issue, the insurance gaps in the gig economy. When does Uber's insurance cover a driver? When does the driver's personal insurance apply? What happens in the gaps between? For years, these questions had been theoretical. Now they were very, very real. So here we are. Data breaches, sexual assaults, plummeting driver pay, surge pricing that borders on price gouging, billion-dollar losses in side ventures, algorithmic deactivations, a deadly self-driving crash, insurance gaps. This isn't a list of isolated incidents. It's a pattern that emerges when a company prioritizes growth above all else, when metrics matter more than people, when move fast and break things becomes not just a strategy, but a culture. And here's what makes this all so complicated, so difficult to reckon with. Uber was also genuinely useful. People wanted these services. Many drivers did benefit from the flexibility. The technology was innovative. The convenience was real. But convenience for whom? And at what cost? Because every one of these operational challenges represents real people, real trauma, real economic hardship, real danger. The 57 million people whose data was stolen and who weren't told for 9 months. The 3,045 sexual assault victims. The drivers whose income dropped 20% overnight. Elaine Herzberg, who lost her life. These aren't abstractions. They're not statistics in a safety report or line items in a legal settlement. They're people. And their experiences, their suffering, their losses, they're the hidden cost of disruption. Uber would eventually try to reform. New leadership, new policies, public commitments to safety and transparency. But the question lingered, were these changes because the company had genuinely learned and grown? Or were they because the public was finally paying attention and the legal and reputational costs of the old way of doing things had become too high? We'll explore that tension between authentic change and calculated public relations as we continue. Because the story isn't over. Uber's still here, still operating, still evolving. But the scars from these years, those don't disappear. And the people who bear them, they remember. Next, we need to talk about the internal culture that made all of this possible. The people who worked at Uber. What they experienced. What they witnessed. And what finally made some of them say, enough? Every empire has its breaking point. That moment when the cracks that have been forming in the foundation suddenly become impossible to ignore. When the whispers become shouts. When the internal becomes devastatingly public. For Uber, that moment came on a Sunday evening in February 2017, when a software engineer named Susan Fowler hit publish on a blog post that would change everything. The post was titled, reflecting on one very, very strange year at Uber. It was detailed, measured, and absolutely damning. Fowler described her year working as a site reliability engineer at Uber. She was good at her job, talented enough to join one of the most high-profile tech companies in the world. But from almost her first day, she encountered something that had nothing to do with code or systems architecture. Her manager propositioned her sexually over company chat. Now, in a functional company, what happens next should be straightforward. You report it to HR. HR investigates. The manager faces consequences. You continue doing your job. That's not what happened. When Fowler reported the incident, HR told her that this manager was a high performer and that this was his first offense, so they weren't going to do anything about it. She was given a choice. She could either switch teams, or she could stay on her current team and just deal with it. And if she stayed, she was warned she'd probably get a poor performance review. Think about that calculus. You report sexual harassment, and you're the one who has to make sacrifices to accommodate your harasser. But it didn't end there. As Fowler tried to transfer teams, she started talking to other women at Uber. And she discovered something horrifying. She wasn't alone. Not even close. The same manager had propositioned other women. HR knew about it. And yet nothing had been done. Because he was a high performer. Because he delivered results. Because in Uber's culture, results were what mattered. Everything else was secondary. Fowler's blog post documented all of this. The harassment, the retaliation, the organizational gaslighting, the way HR protected powerful men and hung women out to dry. She named no names except her own, but she provided enough detail that anyone inside Uber would know exactly who she was talking about. The post detailed more than 20 complaints she personally knew about. 20. And those were just the ones she had direct knowledge of. When the post went viral, and it went massively viral, the reaction was swift and seismic. Uber's board had no choice but to launch an investigation. They brought in former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder and his firm to conduct an independent review. And what they found was worse than almost anyone outside the company had imagined. The investigation uncovered evidence supporting 57 separate claims of harassment, discrimination, or retaliation. 57. And that was just what they could substantiate through their formal probe. 20 executives and employees were fired or resigned, including several top VPs who had been part of Kalanick's inner circle. These weren't low-level employees. These were the people running major divisions of the company. Uber didn't just have a few bad apples. The entire orchard was rotting. While the Holder investigation was underway, something else was happening behind closed doors. Different kind of reckoning. This one in the boardroom. Bill Gurley, a partner at Benchmark Capital and one of Uber's earliest and most influential investors, was leading a quiet coup against Travis Kalanick. Gurley and others on the board had been watching Uber's reputation implode throughout early 2017. The Fowler blog post. The hashtag #DeleteUber campaign we'll talk about in a moment. Regulatory battles around the world. And through it all, Kalanick seemed either unwilling or unable to change course. To Gurley and the other investors, the calculation was becoming stark. Travis Kalanick was now a liability to the company he'd founded. In May 2017, the board essentially forced Kalanick to take a leave of absence. The official reason was that his mother had recently died in a tragic accident, and he needed time to grieve. And that was true. That loss was real and devastating. But it was also a face-saving exit ramp. The board was sending a message: step aside, at least temporarily, or we'll remove you permanently. Kalanick initially resisted. He sent an email to Uber's 15,000 employees that was pure defiance. I'm not leaving. He positioned himself as being pushed out by investors who didn't understand the company, who didn't have the stomach for real disruption. But the board had the votes. And by June 2017, Kalanick was out as CEO. Not on leave. The board needed a new CEO. Someone who could steady the ship. Someone with operational experience at a major tech company. Someone who was, frankly, the opposite of Travis Kalanick. They chose Dara Khosrowshahi. Khosrowshahi had been running Expedia for 12 years. He was known as measured, diplomatic, process-oriented. Where Kalanick was a flamethrower, Khosrowshahi was a fire extinguisher. And Uber was very much on fire. His first acts were symbolic but significant. Within months, he fired 20 executives, people who had been loyalists to Kalanick, people who embodied the old culture. It was a purge, yes, but also a message. This is a different company now. He also ended forced arbitration for sexual harassment claims. Under the previous policy, if you experienced harassment, you couldn't sue Uber publicly. You had to go through private arbitration with outcomes that stayed confidential. It was a way of keeping scandals quiet. Khosrowshahi eliminated it. If you had a claim, you could take it public. You could sue. It was a small policy change with enormous symbolic weight. We're not hiding anymore. Khosrowshahi also did something that, in retrospect, seems almost comically simple, but was actually radical for Uber. He rewrote the company values. Under Kalanick, one of Uber's core values was toe-stepping, the idea that you should push boundaries, challenge norms, and not worry if you piss people off along the way. It was aggression codified as virtue. Khosrowshahi replaced it with "we do the right thing." He added empathy as a value. Again, these sound like corporate platitudes. But in the context of Uber's culture, they were revolutionary. And slowly, very slowly, some metrics started to shift. Diversity hires rose by 10% by 2019. Women in technical roles increased to 25% of the tech workforce. Glassdoor reviews, which had been brutal during the Kalanick era, started to improve. The company's Glassdoor rating jumped from 3.5 to 4.1 by 2020. That might not sound like much, but on a 5-point scale, it's significant. It meant that more employees were saying, "This is a place I'd recommend working." But Kalanick didn't go quietly into retirement. In 2019, he filed a countersuit against Benchmark Capital, the same firm, led by Bill Gurley, that had pushed him out. Kalanick claimed that the board's actions had diluted his shares by $4 billion. $4 billion in lost equity. The lawsuit was messy, bitter, and very public. It exposed just how dysfunctional Uber's board had become. Investors fighting investors. Founders fighting funders. Egos and billions of dollars colliding in court. Eventually, it settled confidentially. Terms undisclosed. But the damage to relationships was permanent. And Kalanick was fully out. No longer on the board, no longer involved in operations. Just a shareholder with a very large, very complicated grudge. Now, let's rewind a bit. Because while the Fowler blog post was the earthquake, there had been tremors before. In January 2017, just a few weeks before Fowler's post, the #DeleteUber campaign exploded on social media. Here's what happened. President Trump issued his controversial travel ban. Protests erupted at airports across the country, including JFK in New York. Taxi drivers went on strike in solidarity with the protesters, refusing to pick up fares at the airport. And Uber. They turned off surge pricing at JFK. They positioned it as being helpful. We're not going to price gouge during a crisis. But protesters saw it differently. By continuing to operate while taxis were striking, Uber was undercutting the protest. They were essentially strike-breaking. The backlash was immediate and intense. #DeleteUber started trending. Over the course of that weekend, approximately 200,000 people uninstalled the app. 200,000. For a company that measured success in user growth, losing 200,000 users in a weekend was a gut punch. And it wasn't just about the numbers, it was about what those deletions represented. These were people saying, "Your company's values don't align with mine." Uber's stock, still private at this point, but traded internally, dipped by about 7%. Investors were spooked. Employees were questioning whether they wanted to work for a company that was becoming a cultural pariah. And then, just weeks later, came Fowler's post. The fire that hashtag Elite Uber had started became an inferno. By the time Uber was ready to go public in May 2019, the company was in a very different place than it had been 2 years earlier. The IPO priced at $45 per share, raising $8.1 billion and valuing the company at $82 billion. On paper, it was one of the most successful tech IPOs in history. But there was a darker subtext. The stock actually dropped on its first day of trading. Investors were skeptical. Could this company, with all its baggage, actually turn a profit? Could it ever justify its massive valuation? Khosrowshahi spent much of the IPO roadshow doing something Kalanick would never have done, apologizing. He went on an apology tour, meeting with mayors and regulators in cities around the world. London, Paris, Toronto, Sydney. The message was consistent. We messed up. We're different now. Please give us another chance. And in many cities it worked. Licenses were renewed. Bans were lifted. Uber was being allowed back in, but on probation. So what happened to Travis Kalanick after Uber? He didn't fade into obscurity. In 2020, his new venture, Cloud Kitchens, hit a $1 billion valuation. The concept was clever. Rent commercial kitchen spaces to restaurants and food delivery startups, essentially the back-end infrastructure for the delivery economy that Uber Eats and DoorDash were building. It was very Kalanick. Find an inefficiency in a growing market. Build infrastructure. Scale fast. And notably, Cloud Kitchens operated much more quietly than Uber had. Fewer press releases. Less public bravado. Maybe he'd learned something. Or maybe he'd just learned to be quieter about the same approach. But even as Uber moved forward under new leadership, the past kept catching up. In 2023, a follow-up report to the original Holder investigation was released. It specifically blamed Kalanick for over 100 separate policy violations that had created or perpetuated Uber's toxic culture. 100 policy violations. Not from the entire company, from one person. The founder and former CEO. The report detailed how Kalanick had personally intervened to protect executives accused of harassment, how he'd encouraged the kind of aggressive, rule-breaking behavior that led to both external legal problems and internal cultural rot, how he'd set a tone from the very top that winning mattered more than how you won. And here's what makes this story so complicated, so difficult to distill into simple lessons. Travis Kalanick built something extraordinary. Uber genuinely changed how millions of people move through cities. It created economic opportunities, flawed and exploitative as they often were, for millions of drivers. It pioneered technologies and business models that reshaped entire industries. But he also built a culture that harmed people, that normalized sexual harassment, that rewarded cruelty and punished empathy, that treated laws as obstacles and people as resources. Can you separate the innovation from the harm? Can you admire the achievement while condemning the methods? Or are they so intertwined that you can't celebrate one without excusing the other? Susan Fowler, whose blog post started this reckoning, left Uber and went on to write a book about her experience. She became a powerful voice in the broader tech industry conversation about workplace culture and harassment. In interviews, she said something that I think gets to the heart of this. She didn't want to destroy Uber. She wanted Uber to be better, to live up to its potential not just as a technology company, but as a place where people could work with dignity and safety. And in that sense, maybe the culture overhaul, imperfect and incomplete as it was, represents something important. Not redemption exactly, but accountability. The recognition that you can't build something sustainable on a foundation of toxicity. By 2020, Uber looked different. Different leadership, different stated values, different public face. But the deeper questions remained. Can a company truly change its culture, or does it just learn to hide its flaws more effectively? When a company reforms under pressure, is it genuine growth or just damage control? And maybe most importantly, what about all the companies watching Uber's rise and fall? What lessons were they learning? Were they learning to treat people better? Or were they just learning to be more careful about getting caught? The Kalanick saga, his rise, his reign, and his removal, is a story about charisma and cruelty, vision and blindness, achievement and cost. It's tempting to make him a villain, and in many ways he earned that role. But he's also a human being who built something unprecedented, who pushed boundaries that probably needed pushing, and who then couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge when he pushed too far. The culture he created at Uber didn't happen by accident. It happened because of choices. Thousands of choices made by thousands of people in a system that rewarded certain behaviors and punished others. And changing that culture, that required different choices, different leaders, different values, different accountability. Whether those changes were deep enough, genuine enough, lasting enough, that's a question Uber is still answering. Next, we need to talk about the economics. Because all of this, the growth, the scandals, the culture wars, it was all happening while Uber was burning through cash at a rate that would make most businesses collapse in weeks. How did they survive? Who funded it? And what were they really buying with all that money? Step back for a moment from the scandals, the lawsuits, the cultural implosions. Step back and look at the bigger picture. Because Uber didn't just disrupt transportation. It disrupted work itself. The gig economy, that term we now use so casually, didn't start with Uber. But Uber perfected it, scaled it, made it a model that hundreds, then thousands of other companies would replicate. Food delivery, grocery shopping, dog walking, furniture assembly, house cleaning, errand running, task after task, service after service, unbundled from traditional employment and repackaged as gigs. And in 2023, the International Labor Organization released a report that put a number to it. 70 million people worldwide were working in the gig economy. 70 million. That's not a niche workforce. That's roughly the entire population of France, or Thailand, or the United Kingdom. An entire nation's worth of people working in this new way. But here's what made that ILO report more than just a census. Those 70 million workers, the vast majority of them lacked pensions, health insurance, unemployment protection, sick leave, all the things that traditional employment provides, or at least used to provide. They were workers without a safety net. And the model that created this situation, it had been copied by over 1,000 apps worldwide. Uber hadn't just built a company. They built a template. And that template was being copied everywhere, spreading this new form of work, flexible, yes, but also precarious across the globe. The legal battles over how to classify gig workers, employee or independent contractor, have been raging for years. But in 2024, something shifted in the United States. The Department of Labor implemented a new rule based on what's called the ABC test. It's a three-part assessment of whether a worker is truly independent or should be classified as an employee. And when this test is applied to Uber drivers, something interesting happened. In 10 states, approximately 20% of Uber's drivers were reclassified as employees. 20%. That might not sound like a majority, but think about what it means. Those drivers suddenly had access to minimum wage protections, overtime pay, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation if they got in an accident. But it also meant something else, higher costs for Uber. Significantly higher costs. Each employee costs a company roughly 30 to 40% more than a contractor when you factor in benefits, payroll taxes, and regulatory compliance. For a company that had spent over a decade burning through investor cash trying to reach profitability, this was existential. The math only worked if drivers were contractors. If they were employees, the entire business model might collapse. Except it didn't. Because by 2024, something remarkable had happened. Uber posted a full-year net profit of $2.2 billion. $2.2 billion in profit. After more than 15 years of losses, they were finally making money. How? Not by suddenly treating drivers better or paying them more. By reducing the number of drivers they needed. Autonomous vehicles. That was Uber's endgame all along. The partnership with Waymo, Google's self-driving car division, was finally bearing fruit. In select cities, autonomous Ubers were handling rides without any human driver at all. And the economics were stunning. Autonomous vehicles cut per-ride costs by roughly 50%. No driver to pay. No rating system to manage. No complaints about the music or the conversation. Just a car that showed up, took you where you needed to go, and returned to pick up the next passenger. For Uber's executives and investors, this was the promised land. All the convenience of ride-sharing without the messy human element, without the labor disputes, without the classification battles. But for drivers, this was an extinction-level event on the horizon. Let's talk about what it actually means to drive for Uber in 2024 and 2025. Because the rhetoric around gig work, be your own boss, work whenever you want, freedom and flexibility, often obscures the economic reality. According to detailed analysis of driver earnings, the median Uber driver makes about $33,000 per year after expenses. That's after you subtract gas, maintenance, insurance, vehicle depreciation, all the costs that come out of the driver's pocket. $33,000 a year. In most U.S. cities, that's below or just barely at the poverty line for a family. It's not entrepreneurship. It's survival. But here's where it gets even more interesting and more troubling. Uber's algorithm doesn't distribute rides evenly. It favors certain drivers. The data shows that about 10% of drivers, the super drivers, get approximately 80% of the rides. This is algorithmic inequality. The top drivers get consistent work, better routes, higher earnings. Everyone else fights for scraps. And what determines who becomes a super driver? It's not entirely transparent. Rating scores matter. Acceptance rates matter. How quickly you respond to ride requests. But it also means that if you need to be strategic about which rides you accept, say, because you can't afford to drive 20 miles to pick someone up for a $5 ride, the algorithm punishes you. You drop in the rankings. You get fewer offers. Your earning potential shrinks. So the flexibility that gig work promises? It's real, but only if you're willing to accept whatever the algorithm offers. The moment you try to exercise judgment to make choices that prioritize your own economic survival, the system works against you. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe was taking a different approach. In 2024, the European Union passed the Platform Work Directive. It was sweeping legislation that applied to all gig economy platforms operating in the EU's 27 member countries. The directive mandated several key protections. Workers had the right to appeal algorithmic decisions, like deactivations or ride assignment patterns. They had rights to minimum pay standards, to transparency about how algorithms made decisions. And Uber, after years of fighting similar regulations, they complied. Not enthusiastically, but they complied. Because the alternative was being banned from the entire European market, which represented too much revenue to sacrifice. It was a fascinating case study. When governments coordinated and set firm rules, even Uber, the company that had built its entire strategy around regulatory defiance, ultimately bent. And then something even more interesting started happening. Uber began piloting a hybrid model in Germany in 2025. For the top 20% of drivers, based on hours worked and ratings, Uber started offering what looked like employee benefits, health insurance, paid leave, even pension contributions. It wasn't full employment. These drivers were still classified as contractors. But it was a middle ground. A recognition that maybe, just maybe, you couldn't sustain a workforce of millions on pure flexibility alone. That people needed some stability. Was it genuine reform? Or was it strategic positioning, giving enough to the most valuable workers to prevent broader regulation? Probably both. Let me tell you about a legal case that reverberated far beyond Uber. In 2021, the UK Supreme Court ruled that Uber drivers were not independent contractors but workers, a classification unique to UK law that sits between contractor and full employee. The ruling was unambiguous. Uber hadn't just misclassified drivers. They had systematically denied them rights they were entitled to under British law. The result? Uber was ordered to pay out approximately £1 billion to 50,000 drivers. Back pay for minimum wage they should have received. Holiday pay they'd been denied. It was one of the most significant gig economy rulings anywhere in the world. But here's what made it even more significant. Other companies were watching. Asda, one of the UK's largest supermarket chains, have been using a gig model for home delivery drivers. After the Uber ruling, they looked at their own practices and realized they were exposed to the same legal risk. They reclassified their drivers, offered employment protections. It was a domino effect, one major ruling causing ripples across entire industries. The Uber model was being copied, yes, but so were the legal precedents forcing that model to evolve. Now let's zoom out even further. Because despite all the problems, all the exploitation, all the precarity, the gig economy has had enormous economic impact. An Oxford University study estimated that the gig economy contributed $6.8 trillion to global GDP by 2025. Nearly $7 trillion. That's a real economy. That's millions of transactions, billions of hours worked, trillions in value creation. And for certain populations, the flexibility genuinely mattered. The study found that women drivers increased by 40% specifically because the work offered flexible hours. Women who needed to coordinate childcare, or who were re-entering the workforce, or who needed to work around other responsibilities for them, being able to work 3 hours today, 7 hours tomorrow, and take Thursday off entirely was genuinely valuable. But here's the tension. Flexibility shouldn't mean exploitation. The fact that a work arrangement offers convenience doesn't mean it should exempt companies from providing basic protections. And slowly, very slowly, systems were emerging to bridge this gap. 15 U.S. states had introduced or passed portable benefit legislation by 2025. The idea was elegant. Create pooled funds that gig workers could pay into across multiple platforms. So if you drive for Uber, deliver for DoorDash, and do tasks on TaskRabbit, you're contributing to a single benefits pool that travels with you. It was an attempt to design social safety nets for a fractured workforce, to provide security without requiring traditional employment. And technology itself was starting to address some of the worst aspects of gig work. AI scheduling systems launched in 2025 were showing promise in reducing driver burnout by about 30%. These systems learn driver patterns, when they preferred to work, how long they typically drove before fatigue set in, which types of routes they found most stressful, and optimized assignments accordingly. It was still algorithmic management, but with a different objective function, not just maximizing rides per hour, but balancing productivity with worker well-being. Was it altruism? No. It was economics. Burned out drivers quit. They make mistakes. They get in accidents. They give bad ratings. Keeping drivers healthier actually improved Uber's bottom line. But for Uber's long-term profitability, the kind of sustained profitability that would justify their massive valuation, the math was clear. By 2030, Uber needed autonomous vehicles to account for approximately 40% of their total miles driven. 40%. That was the threshold where the economics fundamentally shifted, where they could reduce driver costs enough to compete with traditional taxis on price while still maintaining healthy margins. The gig economy that Uber built, it was always meant to be temporary. Bridge technology, a way to rapidly scale until the robots were ready. And the millions of drivers who made that scaling possible, they were, in the coldest possible calculus, placeholders. Temporary labor for a temporary phase. So what are the lessons of the gig economy? First, flexibility is real, and it matters. For millions of people, the ability to work on their own schedule has genuine value. Any solution that moves forward has to preserve that. But second, flexibility without security is a trap. The gig economy proved that you can't sustain a workforce, especially a workforce of 70 million people globally, on variable income alone. People need healthcare, retirement security, protections against arbitrary termination. Third, technology enables both liberation and exploitation. The same algorithms that match drivers with riders efficiently also enable surveillance, control, and inequality. How those algorithms are designed, regulated, and overseen matters enormously. Fourth, the classification debate, employee versus contractor, is probably the wrong framework. We need new categories, new structures, portable benefits, sectoral bargaining, platform cooperatives. The old binary doesn't fit the new reality of work. And finally, when you build a business model that only works by externalizing costs, making workers absorb risks, making cities absorb infrastructure strain, making society absorb the consequences, eventually those bills come due. Uber reached profitability not by finally treating workers fairly, but by beginning to replace them with machines. That's one path forward. But it's not the only one. The gig economy is still evolving, still being fought over in courts and legislatures, still being experienced in millions of individual decisions. Take this ride, decline that one, drive another hour, call it a day. And Uber sits at the center of it all. Not because they're the only player anymore, they're not, but because they were first, because they move fastest, because they built the template that everyone else copied. For better and for worse. There's a quote I think about often when I consider the gig economy. It's from historian Gilles Lepore. History is the art of making an argument about the past by telling a story accountable to evidence. When the past speaks, it says, if you ask a question of the past, it's wise to ask a question you really want answered. The question the gig economy forces us to answer is this: what do we value more, convenience or dignity? Efficiency or security? Innovation or stability? And maybe the answer isn't binary. Maybe it's, can we have both? And if so, were we willing to sacrifice, regulate, or redesign to get there? Those questions don't have easy answers. But they're the questions that will define the future of work. And they're questions that Uber, for all its flaws, all its failures, all its harm, forced us to confront. Next, we're going to pull back even further. Because Uber's story isn't just about one company or one industry. It's about the broader narrative of disruption, about Silicon Valley's ethos, about what happens when move fast and break things becomes not just a strategy, but an ideology.